Welcome to the Guatemalan Dreams Bag Knit-Along. For all machine knitters, it is best if your machine has patterning capabilities, punch card or electronics, either one. This is the bag. The name comes from my youth long ago when bags such as this were all the rage and I desperately wanted one. And I believe they were made with Guatemalan woven fabrics. We're going to do it with machine knitted Fair Isle, however. The originals were very rarely lined, but this version is, so as to make the floats on the Fair Isle no problem. I'm using this card for my sample. It's number 10. I don't know what set it's from. It will work on any Japanese knitting machines. Technically, any Fair Isle card may be used, but traditionally the bags as I remember them had geometric patterns, so that's why I chose this one from my stash. If you don't know how to find the starting row for any knitting machine using any card, I have a video on that, and I will add that video to this playlist so it can help you. I'm using Tam Diamante for the lining and for color 1 of the Fair Isle. It's a number 1 or fingering yarn. I'm using Hirschner's Fashion yarn, a number 2, for color 2 in the Fair Isle. You normally would not, for a garment, mix 2 weights of yarn, but it works well for a bag. I am working on a Studio 740 knitting machine. That's a standard gauge machine, but you can make this in any gauge. Following the instructions as given and using number 1 weight yarn as the main yarn for standards, number 3 weight for mid-gauge, and number 4 weight for bulkies. These are the dimensions you can expect. Depending on your exact yarn choice, they may vary slightly, but who really cares for a purse? Do choose a slightly heavier yarn for color 2. Before beginning, insert the card and lock it on the first patterning row. How to find the first patterning row is part of the video that I mentioned earlier, and I'll give you a link. We will be alternating normal knitting, that's stockinette settings, with Fair Isle settings. Here's the normal knitting setting on a Singer or Studio machine. Here is the Fair Isle setting on the same machine. On Brothers, set the change knob to KC for Fair Isle and N for the stockinette portions. The all the way forward position locks the card on the first row. Push the center buttons in when it's time to knit in Fair Isle. And of course, add color 2 to feeder 2 when it's time to begin knitting Fair Isle. Begin by E-wrapping 56 needles. I'm showing you just a little bit here because most people know how to do this. If you're new, I have a very detailed video on E-wrapping, and I'll put a link in the notes. Start with the row counter on 0. Also begin by setting the carriage on the stockinette stitch size. For the yarns that I'm using, I use 7 for the stockinette and 10 for the Fair Isle. Make sure that the carriage is set to knit back from hold. It's the 2 mark on this machine. On the Brother NH button, choose N. After E-wrapping and knitting the first row, it can be helpful to knit the next couple of rows back from hold also. That gets everything going smoothly and cuts down on dropped stitches. After that point, we can easily get our claw weights on there and things tend to go more smoothly. So knit plain stockinette until 60 rows of it have been completed. Now on the carriage side, bring out 2 extra needles and increase on these 2 needles using the double E-wrap. That's under 2 needles over 1, pull back a loop, and then wrap the final needle once and close the loop. Then cause them to knit back from hold for the next row. After that, we can get a claw weight right on them. Knit 1 row and then do the same on the other side. Notice that I brought out one needle that was already working, plus the two more, and incorporated that into the wrap. It just holds the fabric together more smoothly at the increase to do that. This is a small refinement. Just mainly make sure that you do successfully increase 2 stitches on each side of the work. Knit one more row. The row count should now be 62. And all of the new stitches should be successfully knitting. On a Brother machine, the setup is slightly different from a Singer or Studio, in that while the carriage is still on the left side, before knitting row 62, put the change knob over to KC. That way, when you knit from left to right, the needles will be selected for the fair isle, which will shortly follow. Now change from stockinette settings to fair isle settings, as was discussed at the beginning of the movie. Unlock the card so that it can advance. Add color 2 to feeder 2. I like to anchor color 2 by putting a loop on the rightmost needle and actually knitting it through. That avoids any problems with it slipping out while trying to knit the first row. Now we're going to knit 120 fair isle rows, but stop after 60. We'll get to that point in a minute. At that point, we will need to make a design decision. During these rows, it's very helpful to keep moving the claw weights up pretty often. That keeps the edges knitting off neatly. The fair isle is forming nicely, and while I continue to knit, let me explain to you about the increases made a few rows ago just before beginning the fair isle. Because of the floats, fair isle is not as stretchy widthwise and tends to be narrower than stockinette, and we want the exterior of the bag to be as wide as the interior. That takes a few extra stitches. If all 120 of the fair isle rows are knitted with the card in the same direction, the triangles on the 2 sides of the bag won't be pointing the same way. 60 rows, we've reached the bottom of the bag. So if it matters to you that the design face the same direction on both sides of the bag, take the card out now, flip it end to end, insert it from the opposite end. To do this, you'd need to go through the setup and memorizing process for your machine after knitting the first 60 rows, and that makes the bag a little bit more of an advanced project. For this design, I was not concerned about triangles with points up versus points down, so I knitted the entire 120 fair isle rows. So one way or the other, finish the 120 fair isle rows. The row counter should now read 182. That's 60 stockinette rows plus the 2 rows upon which we increased, plus 120 fair isle. Now remove color 2 and restore the plain stockinette settings. Remember to return to the stockinette stitch size. Knit 1 row. Bind off 2 stitches on the carriage side. That should be the left side, and I'm just doing it by hand because it's only 2 after all. Now knit to the other side and bind off 2 over here as well. So now we're back to the original number of stitches. What we've knitted so far is half of the lining from the E-wrap start, all of the exterior, and now we'll knit the second half of the lining. So from this point, that's 60 stockinette rows to go. By the time they are knitted, there should be 244 showing on the row counter. These are some pretty long floats, which I normally wouldn't like to have, but we are about to enclose them in the lining, so they won't be a problem. Reach all the way down to the E-wrap cast on, find those E-wraps, and hang them on the working needles. Here I'm almost across and just finishing up. If you would prefer to cast bind off from left to right. You may knit one more row after this. It really won't affect the design in any kind of way. Now bind off using any method you prefer. I'm going super fast here and binding off around the gate pegs. If you need a little bit of help with that skill, I do have an entire video on the subject, which I will include in the playlist for reference so that you can learn it too. So all the knitting is now done. That seam will be at the center of the bottom of the bag on the inside. Here's the exterior, and the lining will tuck right into it. The knitting is complete. The pocket is optional, but it's a really good technique to learn and very, very easy, and that's on a separate video. And in order to keep the length of these videos within reason, the finishing that really turns this into a purse is also a separate video. So moving on, I'll see you in those. And by the way, there will be a written pattern for this purse offered to Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. It will include more sizes.